Hey there, and welcome to the Maryland Inclusive History Podcast. I'm Tim Weens. I'm the Executive Director of Maryland Inclusive Housing, and I'm really glad to be here today. This show is about digging into the stories that often get left out of the textbooks and voices and communities and moments that shaped Maryland in a powerful way. Today's roundtable is part of a digital storytelling initiative supported by a Maryland 250 Anniversary Inclusion History Grant. We're diving into the evolution of inclusive housing for people with disabilities generally, but people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in particular in Maryland, how it's changed, where it's headed, and the stories that have shaped it along the way. You'll hear from disability advocates Kathy Raggio, Steve Eidelman, and Tracy Wright as they explore the milestones, challenges, and breakthroughs that often go unrecognized in the broader historical record. I have known Tracy and Kathy and Steve for decades, so when they all agreed to be on this podcast, I was delighted. Tracy is a member of the MIH Board of Directors. She is currently the Deputy Director of People on the Go of Maryland, a self-advocacy organization. She worked for the ARC of Maryland for 15 years and has also worked for Disability Rights Maryland. Kathy Raggio served for 7 years as the Secretary of the Maryland Department of Disabilities, a cabinet level position. She was the founder and executive director of Independence Now, a center for independent living in Maryland, and is the author of Great Falls I've Taken, a memoir, which is available on Amazon and which I have read and would highly recommend to you. Steve Eidelman is the executive director of the Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation. He is the co-founder of the National Leadership Consortium on Developmental Disabilities at the University of Delaware and the former executive director of the ARC of the United States. I could go on and on about these people, but I won't, and I'll let them speak for themselves. We're going to start sort of on a personal level, and I'm going to have Tracy and Kathy talk about their experience growing up with a disability, and we'll start with Tracy.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I am a person with cerebral palsy, and I've had cerebral palsy all my life. And currently, I use a wheelchair for mobility, but it all hasn't always been that way. When I was younger, I used crutches and a wheelchair and a walker at different times at different stages of my life. So mobility has always been something I've had to deal with when considering where I live and the accessibility needs that I have.
And Kathy?
I had polio shortly before my third birthday, and I spent about a month in the hospital. And then when I was no longer contagious, I was sent to a rehabilitation center for children. It was called the Industrial Home for Crippled Children. And I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, so that's where that was located. But I spent 14 months at the Industrial Home for Crippled Children, and they dropped the name industrial shortly after I got there. And it is still in existence today, but it's had several different names. I spent 14 months there. Visiting hours were from 2 to 4 on Saturday and Sunday. So for those 14 months, I saw my parents 4 hours a week. And that was, the whole experience was quite traumatizing, as you can imagine. And I came out of that situation as a highly independent 4-year-old. I want to fast forward to an experience I had when I was 11. I went back to the home following one surgery and preceding another. And the day that I was to go to Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh, cross town, another girl who had cerebral palsy and was nonverbal, and I were to go together. And I had never met her because there were 2 places in the home, one for individuals who needed personal assistance and one for those of us who were independent in that regard. So accompanying us was not one of the home staff. It was a volunteer from the Red Cross who neither of us had ever met. And this is a life-defining experience for me because my reaction was that if I was scared, she must have been terrified, the other girl. So we got over to the hospital, and of course, she was not able to communicate with the nursing staff. And I don't know whether it was just luck or whether it was divine intervention. But I was able to understand mostly what she wanted and what she wanted to tell the nursing staff what she needed. And, we bonded. They put us in adjacent beds. When I went up for surgery, hers was delayed and eventually canceled. But I came back and I was heavily sedated and in terrible pain. So my mom and my aunt were there and they supported this girl. Her parents lived in Lancaster, which was quite a distance from Pittsburgh, and they were not able to be there. So that experience impacted my life in a way that it affected the college major that I chose, speech and language disorders, and it affected my entire career. I became an advocate for other individuals with disabilities.
Steve, talk a little bit about how you came into the field, kind of your history and your recollections from years ago.
Well, first of all, I was trying to search my data banks to see, what do I remember? And I remember my sixth grade class at Highland View Elementary School in Silver Spring. There was a classroom at the end of the building, at the end of the hall, and it was all kids with Down syndrome. And they had different lunch hours than the rest of us. They had different playground stuff. So my initial exposure was kids with disabilities were separate. And we were told not to really talk about them and to socialize with them. But my first real experience with housing was I was a graduate student, I'm a social worker, and I was placed at what's now called the Kennedy Krieger Institute. And we went to a group home in Roland Park in Baltimore with 22 people. It was one of those big old Roland Park houses with, porches and bedrooms and turrets, 22 people. And they had all come from Rosewood. And it was amazing talking to the people about their experience because all of a sudden they could go to the store and they could walk outside and they could have friends over and they could do other things. Didn't quite get the 22 number. Today we'd look at that and go, oh my, that's horrible. But then it was not horrible. And then I got assigned to a project where we went to follow the people leaving Rosewood, went to Holly Center in Salisbury. And I think it was one of the last public institutions built in the United States. And it was seen as innovative and forward thinking and progressive. It had small units, had lots of things for people to do. It was not out in the country. It was right in the suburbs of Salisbury. And most of the people who went from Rosewood to Holly Center were people whose families lived on the Eastern Shore, not all, but most. So it was a brand new segregated housing facility, but at least it was new and clean, and Rosewood was none of those things.
So I'm curious, Kathy and Tracy, if you have memories. I mean, Kathy, you talked about where you lived, but other memories of kind of what housing options there were and what housing looked like for people with disabilities 30 or 40 years ago.
I can tell you that when I went to school, we often had very long rides home on the bus, and I was on the bus with one of my good friends, and she didn't communicate with words, and we would drop her off first, and I thought she must be the richest kid I knew because her house was so big, but it was really an institution. And I didn't know, and she would cry the whole way home, and I didn't understand why. And it was because we were going home, and she wasn't going home. She was going back to the institution. So going to school was really the only chance she had to be around people that would interact with her. And it wasn't until many years later I grew up and moved into apartment complex with other people with disabilities, and I ran into her, and she had moved out of Great Oaks and was had been in a group home and then moved to her own apartment. and she had a communication device, and I could talk to her about why she cried when we would be on the bus. And I found out that it was because she wasn't going home to her family. And then when I got started in advocacy, um, People on the Go took a trip down to Howie Center to see um, the institution there. And I had always grown up with my dad and as a single parent, and we had a very small apartment, and it wasn't very easy to get around. And so when I went into Howie Center, the hallways were big and they had color on the walls because we had white walls in my apartment. And I thought, wow. And there were people like me there. And I thought, wow. And it wasn't until I realized that they they didn't get to really have friends over, and they didn't get to choose what time they got up and what time they went to bed or who the roommate was or any of that, that I really understood that even though it was hard in my apartment, that I was very lucky to get to live with my dad in our apartment. That was hard to get around at times, but much better to live at home.
My first exposure to housing for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities was a state institution in Pennsylvania. That was my first job out of college. I went to work in the speech and hearing department at Selinsgrove, which I'm sure Steve is quite familiar with. And I worked there for 5 years, and I'll never forget the first time I went in there for my job interview. Um, One of the other staff took me on a tour, and I was just appalled at what I saw. I came out of there wondering how I was ever going to go back there to work. Um, and, you know, just found it to be a deplorable place. And I left there after 5 years and became familiar with what Pennsylvania was doing at the time with 3-person group homes, and later got involved with that.
So let's kind of pivot to some history. And I think pivotal to the history in Maryland is Rosewood. Rosewood, I believe, was the oldest institution for
Yes.
people. And you know, Kathy, you were very instrumental and involved in its closure. And I'm going to let you start talking about Rosewood, but I know both Steve and Tracy have had connections to that process. So talk a little bit about Rosewood and what led to its closure, Kathy.
Okay. Well, Rosewood opened in 1888, and by the 1980s, when I was at the Developmental Disabilities Council, um, what was then called the Federal Healthcare Financing Administration, or HCFA, now called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, they were doing look-behinds, which were unannounced visits, sometimes after midnight, and they were finding that the place was not in good condition. The plant was not, and the services were not very good for people. The state tried to do active treatment, including sending some of the residents to community day programs over the years. But then if we fast forward to the year 2000, there was a death at Rosewood, and the what's now the Disability Rights Maryland did a report. They issued a report in January of 2001 called A Death at Rosewood. And what that involved was in December 2000, a young man named Mark died there, and he had been a resident for over 9 years. And he had died while he was restrained by Rosewood staff, and the state medical examiner concluded that Mark died of cardiac arrhythmia during restraint. And at the time of the autopsy, the medical examiner found more than 20 contusions, lacerations, bruises, and hemorrhages on his body. So that really caused the advocacy community in Maryland to spring into action. And we were all advocating for a closure of Rosewood then. But it took about 7 more years after Mark died to make much happen. In November 2006, Martin O'Malley was elected governor of Maryland, and I applied to be the secretary of the Department of Disabilities because I knew the importance of closing Rosewood for one, and also doing some additional policy work. And so I was hired. And during my interviews, both with the original screening committee, and one of the co-chairs of the committee was Anthony Brown, who was Governor O'Malley's lieutenant governor, who is now Maryland's attorney general. So then I had my second interview with the governor himself, and I made the closing of Rosewood my #1 priority. My second day on the job, I met with the new secretary of the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, now just the Department of Health. And that was John Colmers. And thanks to Diane McComb, who was the deputy secretary at the time, and she was a holdover from the Ehrlich administration, the previous governor, she had set up a meeting. I had asked her to set up a meeting with the new Secretary of Health, and she set that up for my second day on the job. So I met with John, and he was on board after our conversation with closing Rosewood, and he charged the Developmental Disabilities Administration with preparing a plan to close it. So I had a one-to-one meeting with Governor O'Malley in the fall of 2007 to discuss the closure of Rosewood. And he was supportive of it, but he was sensitive and concerned about the families and their concerns and the union, because he had been hearing, especially from the families, because they knew that things were not good at Rosewood, and the state was looking at closing it. Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, I met with him in the fall of 2007. Department of Health and Mental Hygiene submitted the plan to him in November 2007. On January 15th, the governor held a press conference at Rosewood and signed an executive order to close it. At the time, there were 156 residents there. 13 of them were court committed and were deemed not able to be placed in the community at that particular time. So they were moved to another institution. But the remainder, the Department of DDA and Department of Health developed individual plans for each person, involved their families. And the last person left in May of 2009, and it officially closed on June 30th, 2009. Now, I want to say that before he held the press conference, Governor O'Malley met with the families to hear their concerns. And then after the press conference, met with the union representatives. So he gradually brought everybody on board with this and gave them assurance that their concerns would be addressed. And so Rosewood closed, and nobody misses it.
Well, I had the privilege of mentoring 40 individuals and working with them as they transitioned into the community. And at first I would meet weekly with people who were moving, some of with communicated in alternative ways. And as the days got closer to closure, there were less and less staff to be able to support those meetings. So we were kind of left on our own to get to know each other and kind of figure out our ways to communicate. But what I found very quickly was people always, no matter their support needs, surprised me on how much they wanted to share about who they were and what they were scared of or had questions about in different ways. And it was really truly a pleasure to get to know them and go with them through their journey. I actually got to follow 13 people for 6 months after they moved into the community, visiting them twice a month to see how things are going and to try to help get them connected to the community. We developed kind of welcome to your community baskets with different places that were in the community that they might like to go to visit, with gift cards so they could, if there was a cost to going, that they could go and try things out, finding out where the libraries were, if there were community activities. So it was really a interesting time to get to be a part of, to watch people grow and change. One man I had the privilege of getting to know, he communicated in alternative ways, and he had two staff to support him. And he had trouble leaving Rosewood. Um, but we later discovered that part of that was because every time he would leave to Rosewood, he would go off to a medical appointment usually. And so every time we went to go do something outside of Rosewood, at the beginning, it was very traumatic for him. And because he didn't communicate in traditional ways, it was very challenging to get to know what he was concerned about. But I will say, one of my last memories of getting to spend time with him, I got to spend time with him at his house on his front porch with a communication board. And he told me that one of the things he liked to do so much was feeding ducks at his local park in the community. And it got to the point where we could actually travel together to go to the park. And that was just such a surprise to me, that he adjusted to the community so well and enjoyed being a part of his community. And I think both his supporters and his family were very concerned, and but it went well for him. And I know that he was much happier in his townhouse than he was living at Rosewood in a cottage by himself.
You know, I went to Rosewood in high school. I had a part-time job as a delivery guy for a drugstore, my dad's drugstore in Pikesville, and we delivered stuff to Rosewood, to the staff who lived there. And I took an order one day, and it was for a nurse who ran a unit, and the unit had 20 people with hydrocephalus. And this is before they had figured out shunting. So people had huge heads, were in cribs. Some of them were adults, and there was one staff member for 20 people. And to this day, when I shut my eyes and listen to the quiet, I can smell it and hear it. And it was horrible. And it sort of shaped my whole view of how people with disabilities could live, because it shouldn't be that. I don't know what it should be, but it shouldn't be that.
So, Steve, talk about the bigger context here. This is obviously a Maryland story, but this was happening all over the country. You were, of course, involved with this in Pennsylvania. Talk about the bigger context of what was happening nationwide here.
Well, Kathy hit on part of it. In 1974, we got Medicaid into the state institutions, and it was done, the ICF program was done because advocates wanted the institutions to improve. They were horribly staffed. They were in bad shape physically. People got lousy care. And so we developed this thing called active treatment, which is a totally made up term and has no meaning whatsoever. And after a couple of years of that, people started saying, well, wait a minute, if we can have Medicaid there, why can't we have Medicaid in the community? And it took until 1981 when the Medicaid waiver was passed through Congress, and it was sort of appended to an Omnibus Reconciliation Act in the middle of the night, the day before it had to pass. And all of a sudden we could use Medicaid to move people to the community. And the different states did it differently. And to this day, states do it differently. With Pennsylvania, the idea Kathy talked about was 3 people in a group home, called a community living arrangement. Well, 3 people was not a magic number. It was the number of people you could have unrelated in a house without getting zoning. So you could move into a neighborhood without having to ask anybody's permission. And institutional closures went fairly fast after that. You know, we're down to very few left. There are 4 states that are outliers still. The meetings with families and the meetings with the union are very typical of what happened. Almost none of them closed without a scandal. there was always something horrible. Willowbrook was the most well-known because of Geraldo Rivera and Senator Robert Kennedy, and it was in the New York media market. In Pennsylvania, it was, excuse me, Pennhurst, and it was because a news reporter went there undercover with a camera and saw horrible things and literally showed up at this is before security is such a big deal, showed up at the lieutenant governor's house, knocked on his door and said, "You got to see this video." And that's what was the impetus there. And that repeated itself in Alabama and Texas and California and Oregon and Illinois. So it was part of a much bigger movement to get people closer to the community. And again, it played out in different ways in different states.
So, Steve, while you're talking about this trend, in your work, I know you've worked very much with the Kennedy family, and the Kennedy family and the fact that John F. Kennedy had a sister with a developmental disability was instrumental in a lot of change in the attitudes. Just reflect a little bit on that.
So Rosemary Kennedy had a disability, and she was in a private residential facility in Wisconsin. And I went and visited her once, but it was really Eunice Kennedy Shriver who put the bug into President Kennedy's ear. And then in 1968, she founded Special Olympics. And no one thought at the time kids, because it was about kids in the beginning, with intellectual disabilities could play sports and participate and be on teams. And she showed the world that that could happen. There's sort of a famous scene where the first National Special Olympic Games were in Chicago, and she gave a speech that's online today. It still is powerful. It said, "You can live anywhere, you can do anything, you have the same rights as everyone else, you can play sports, you can have a job, you can have a family." And at the opening ceremonies of that game, Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley, said to the people in the audience, "The world will never be the same." And I think to this day, Eunice Kennedy Shriver's emphasis and fearlessness and powerfulness has changed the face of what people with intellectual disabilities have and don't have worldwide. It's not just the United States. We ain't there yet, however. And we always sort of see these things coming up where the horrible situation just happened in Oklahoma, where people with disabilities in an institution got abused. So we're not there, but we're getting there.
So before we move on past history, I want to see if Kathy or Tracy want to add anything to this.
Well, I would just add and build upon what Steve said. One of the people in Pennsylvania who was instrumental in getting Pennhurst closed was Tom Gilhool, who was a close personal friend of mine. And I didn't know until they held a symposium what his strategy was, but he was first approached by the Arc of Pennsylvania to do litigation to close Pennhurst. And instead, he brought the right to education lawsuit, which became known as the Park Consent Decree, because his belief was that before you close the institution, you needed to prove that all children could be served by the public schools. And once you did that, there was no justification for institutionalizing anybody.
I still have scars from being deposed by Tom Gilhool, so he was an amazing advocate, an amazing attorney, but an amazing advocate in terms of the rights of people with disabilities to have a decent life.
Yes, he was.
Well, I guess just one thing I would add that it stands out that I forgot to mention, I also got the opportunity to talk to some of the staff as they were transitioning from Rosewood, and some actually went into community. And one of the ladies that had worked at Rosewood for over 45 years told me about how she would used to have to shower people, and Rosewood's very early days, they actually lined people up and took a garden hose and sprayed everybody off because there wasn't enough staff to be able to give everybody a shower and have privacy. So I remember that to this day, and every time I take a shower, I think of that, and I think how fortunate I am to be able to take a shower in privacy and have the support to do so.
So kind of moving into advocacy and what role that has played in making changes. Tracy, just to kind of continue on what you were talking about, you're part of a self-advocacy group. Talk about the role of self-advocacy and some of the heroes that have made things happen in Maryland and beyond.
Well, I always joke that I'm 21 forever, but this year I turned 22 because it's been such a hard year. But when I was first in self-advocacy, I wasn't sure and got started in People of the Go that was the place for me. But I met people that had lived in Rosewood and other state institutions, and they actually would share about their journey and share about what it meant to be a part of a group where they were able to help make change happen for people on the state level and be a part of discussions with other partner organizations where they were able to share what they thought about things and the importance of knowing their rights and getting to say, where they wanted to live or who they wanted to live with or where they wanted to be supported, and whether they wanted to live in the country or in the city and things like that. And I just, from that time on and meeting a lot of those people, because a lot of those people have since passed away, but they always in the back of my mind reminding me that that's why People in the Go exist, and that we have to, and today it's more important than ever to make sure that all people's voices are heard, no matter what types of support you need, how much support you may need. Everybody has a voice in saying how they want to be included and be a part of the community. And everybody has the right to do that and live and work and play in their community just like everybody else.
Steve or Kathy, do you have other voices that have been heard that have made a difference that you would want to highlight?
Well, Tim, as you know, I was with the Developmental Disabilities Council throughout the 1980s. And while we were not addressing housing as such, we were building the capacity of the community. When I first moved to Maryland in 1979, I moved out of Pennsylvania where the 3-person group homes were prevalent. And in Maryland, they were trying to build an institution in Southern Maryland. So the DD Council put an end to that and said, no, we're not going to do that. And instead put some money into a demonstration project in Southern Maryland where we were funding some small group homes, and the day programs already existed. So that was good. And throughout the 80s, the DD Council did that, and they did that building capacity. We did that through not only through grants, but through position papers and conferences and that sort of thing, where all of the focus was on community, always, never on institutions. And we weren't necessarily ever talking about what was going on in the institutions. Our job was to build the capacity of the community. And one of the key things that we did was we rewrote what was called Article 59A, which was at that time called MR law. And it later became Title IX, Developmental Disabilities law. But we put a provision in there in the mid-80s when we rewrote that to prevent any new admissions to institutions unless there was, extreme justification for it, such as legal intervention on behalf of an individual or whatever. So, our strategy was if we built the community that was good and strong, no one would forget, or no one would remember, rather, the institutions. Everyone would forget about them as a possible placement for individuals. So I think we made a good contribution there. And the council was critical to this because, of its membership. We had so many families and individuals with disabilities with whom the community resonated. That's what they wanted. And that's what we were able to get.
One of the things we're experiencing now is there's a whole generation of young professionals and young families who have no idea of this background. When we do our leadership training, we share a book called Christmas in Purgatory, which was published in 1969, 67. And Burton Blatt, a professor at Syracuse University, and Fred Kaplan, a photographer, went undercover to two institutions and then published this book. And it's a picture book. And it's hard to this day, it's horrible. You see people without clothes on wandering around, people with no privacy. And that fed into the ICF regulations because people said we got to do something the opposite of that. Well, there's a whole generation that's forgotten that stuff or never knew it in the first place. And we're sort of living with some of the mistakes we made. When we started moving people to the community, we said, and it's cheaper. It's cheaper. We're going to support people in the community. It'll be better. It's cheaper. Well, it's cheaper because we pay people less. And that's the primary reason. It's not cheaper inherently. People who need support need support. But we also found that people who had, quote, behaviors in the institution when they moved out and had a place where they could shut the door to their bedroom and have a little privacy, most of those behaviors went away. They had control of the big stuff in their lives, and all of a sudden, hey, I can go to bed when I want, I can have friends over, I can watch TV or not, I can go for a walk or not. That kind of freedom is too often taken for granted, but it's really meaningful to people's lives.
And people that always say behavior is a form of communication, and it's just if people really listen or not.
So let's pivot to kind of what's happening now. What do you see happening in our world and in our society in the field of services to people with developmental disabilities that are encouraging? What are the things that are of concern? Talk about what you see happening now.
Well, we've always had this problem with having enough people to do direct support, people who needed support. And a lot of those people were immigrants. In Delaware, where I was working, was about 20% of the staff came from other countries. Well, that pipeline's been cut off. So we had a challenge before. The challenge has gotten bigger. And at the same time, we always had as a backstop the Department of Justice, the Office of Civil Rights, who could stay there and push and make sure things were comporting with law and the Constitution. And they've stopped doing that. They have those two things, and then we become Medicaid addicts. Everything we do is almost funded by Medicaid, and now Medicaid's under attack. So we're at a tipping point where we have people who don't want to go into institutions, people who don't want to go to group homes, they want to live in their own places. And at the same time, the funding is being diminished, and the ability of people who can provide the support is being diminished. And as a result, a whole new group has sprung up that's promoting congregate living again. And they've got a lot of money and a lot of influence, and they have one issue. They want congregate living, whether it's a farm or a village or an apartment building. And they're getting traction. They're getting traction with the national government. They're getting traction with states. So again, we're not there yet.
Yeah, I mean, that actually started in Maryland, Steve, when I was still at the Department of Disabilities, and I've been gone 11 years now. But we were very concerned that there were a couple of groups that were pushing for the village concept in Montgomery County and in Howard County at the time. And Timmy mentioned the new apartment complex in Howard County, Patuxent Commons. I think that was a compromise there, the development of that so that it would have people with and without disabilities. And I don't believe anything was built in Montgomery County, but one of the concerns that I have and have had since that has been that it has succeeded in a few other places in the southern states. And, we go back to that's where those people live. And so, as much as the families want to see a place that will be accepting of their sons and daughters, I don't think they have considered the stigma within the community of that's where those people live, because they're never fully included when they're perceived as those people and they need a special place to live.
Especially the idea of special classrooms where those people go, those kids, they're isolated, and it's never a good thing. We can't learn from each other if we're isolated from each other.
So we're obviously facing huge challenges that you all have articulated very well. Any things that you see that are encouraging, that are happening?
I think self-directed services are very encouraging. But again, given the financial constraints that states are going to be up against as a result of what's happening at the federal level, I think that that's probably in jeopardy as well, as they tend to be pretty costly. Some, not all.
And I'm seeing families of children who are transitioning at a high school age saying, I don't want a group home, I don't want a day program, I want my son or daughter to live in a neighborhood, have their own place, do their own thing. And they have the same passion that families who institutionalize their kids had about, we got to save them, we got to protect them. So there's this whole stream of thought that's moving in the direction of self-direction and individual supports and families, including their sons and daughters. Again, we're not there yet, but it's a very powerful movement, and they're really articulate and they really are passionate. And those things have served us well as a field.
So looking ahead, we've talked about this a little bit, self-direction is one of the trends. What do you see? Do you see anything in terms of housing and, people moving into their own homes and that making progress? What does that look like? How do you see progress being made in that area?
The good thing about housing is there are people who know how to do it. It's not magic, right? There are people who know how to build housing, how to renovate housing, how to develop housing. We've not been very successful as a field, as a movement of sort of partnering with those folks. There are examples all over the place, but it's still not the main model of doing things. And this development in Howard County, Tucson Commons, is sort of one way of approaching it. It happens to be across the street from where I live, so I'm sort of watched it develop and build. But for every unit of low-income housing that's decent and affordable and safe, another unit goes out because the subsidies for housing are so low. So we're sort of clawing our way forward, but we take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But the answer is in part housing. If people have a decent place to live, so many of the other issues we face sort of fade out.
I haven't mentioned Independence Now and our work with housing, but that's where I really got involved with housing. I was asked to write the proposal and start Independence Now. So we started from scratch and got a big grant from the federal government to get it started. It's one of 400 centers for independent living in the United States, and it serves Montgomery and Prince George's counties, which of course are the 2 largest counties in the state. And right away, people knew I had a background working at, I had done a project for United Cerebral Palsy National as a consultant years ago with the great Alan Bergman and Michael Morris. And it was getting people out of nursing homes as a result of, or taking advantage of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1987. Now, there's a blast from the past with the pre-admission screening and annual resident review requirements known as PASSAR. So people in the 2 counties knew that I had that kind of background. And so we no sooner opened than we began getting calls from people who wanted to get out of nursing facilities. And we found out how hard it was. I mean, there was not an array of supports and services once they got out, and then just getting them rental housing, subsidized housing was very, very difficult. It was easier in Montgomery County, because they had a very aggressive Housing Opportunities Commission who sought out federal funds, federal subsidies for people. And in Prince George's County, when we opened, there was, they had not opened the waiting list for Section 8 for 10 years. That was just the waiting list. And then it took probably another 10 years if you got on the waiting list to get housing, rental housing. So, our work was very difficult, and it preceded Money Follows the Person, but I think we began to lay the groundwork for that. Independence Now was the first organization in Maryland that began to get younger people with disabilities out of nursing facilities and into their own units. I think, in the 12 years that I was there, we may have done, 2025, but it inspired another advocate. And you asked who are unsung heroes. I would maintain the late Gail Hafner was one of the unsung heroes in Maryland. She saw what we were doing. She called me when she first moved to Maryland to find out what we were doing at Independence Now, and I told her. And she then approached Jim Hubbard, who was a delegate from Prince George's County to the Maryland General Assembly, and asked him to sponsor legislation called Money Follows the Person Act. And then a couple of years later, she had to come back because it wasn't working real well, and it became the Money Follows the Individual's Accountability Act, and then it did. But that laid the groundwork for Maryland to get one of the first Money Follows the Person federal grants. And from there, that really launched everything. And, more services and supports were available to people, everything from the personal care that people needed to durable medical equipment, technology, et cetera, under the Medicaid waiver. So, but we started in Prince George's to address the housing issue since it was so bad there. We started a coalition. Independence Now was the convener, and we had gotten to know some members of the county council and some staff members at the Department of Housing. I had also gotten to know my colleague at a nonprofit housing developer called Housing Initiative Partnership, or HIP. Her name was Mosey Harrington. And so she was developing housing, and she was real fascinated with what we were advocating for. So the next property that she developed, she included units for people with disabilities. She asked me to come out and consult on the accessibility there. And so I did, and got a few other people involved. She also built into each of her properties a computer center for families with their children, so they didn't have to have individual computers in their residences, and craft and recreation rooms for both the kids and their parents. So, she was very responsive to what we're doing. And in exchange, she taught me about housing financing. And I think that's one of the hardest things for disability advocates to really understand is how housing financing works and how you have to pull money from here and there to make it happen. And because of our work in Prince George's, we did not get one person out of an institution in Prince George's County. And Mosey kept reminding me of that. Well, we've been together for 3 years and we still have not gotten one person out of an institution yet. Some of them from Prince George's were moving into Montgomery where they could get Section 8. But I also got to know Pat Sylvester, who's another unsung hero. Pat worked at the Department of Housing and Community Development at the time. She heard what we were doing in Prince George's County, and she got to know us and really got involved with the disability community. Later went to work at the Department of Disabilities as their housing director. So, we began to make things happen. And Pat and I went and did a presentation for the Weinberg Foundation. And we got them to commit at that point in time $1 million worth of money. We met with the board of directors, and they were pretty receptive to what we were doing, although I was advocating for housing to be at transit-oriented developments so people would have access to transportation, knowing how many people with disabilities don't drive. And they didn't want to see that, but at the time, they were open to considering it in the future. So they pledged $1 million, and then after I retired, they pledged another $1 million, and then that enabled the State Department of Housing to get a $10 million grant from HUD to do the same thing. And so, the state then was off and running with the creation of the housing piece that was so desperately needed for people who wanted to use the waivers.
You'd be pleased to know, Kathy, that Prince George's County in October, after 15 years, is opening its waiting list, its Section 8 waiting list.
Only 15 years, huh?
And they've asked us, Maryland Inclusive Housing, to partner with them to make sure that people with disabilities, have an adequate shot at getting some of those new vouchers. So
Excellent. That's excellent.
small, little progress happening there, which we're delighted to see.
Yeah, well, you have to understand what happens in Prince George's. You've got people porting their vouchers into Prince George's all the time because it is the most affordable of the district or the counties that surround the district.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So you're going to go where their vouchers can get them the most housing.
Well, let me see, Steve or Tracy, if you have kind of final thoughts. We're getting close to wrapping up here. Kind of looking toward the future.
I just hope that even though, we're hitting some financial struggles, that we don't go backwards and that people keep pushing forward, even though it's challenging and even though everybody's fighting to keep money and be able to keep going, that we know we've started moving forward and we can't go back for people with disabilities at all.
And I think we have to have two opposing thoughts at the same time. And one is just what Tracy just said. We have to keep moving forward and making sure that more people have access to the kinds of things they want and need. At the same time, we have to have a rear guard action against these folks who are building the segregated stuff. Because once you build a new building, it's around for 50 years.
Yeah.
And people see it and there's a need and boom. So there's a difference between the need for housing and the size of the housing you get. And we haven't made a very good case for that, but we need to do a better job. But there's hope. I'm cautiously optimistic most days, not all days.
Kathy, any final thoughts?
It's, the same that, I do not want to see us go back. We've, all of us have dedicated our lives to building what we have today, and we don't want to see that destroyed. So, we've got to keep moving forward, and I'm not sure exactly how we stop the folks who want to build congregate housing, but I agree with Steve that we need to come up with a plan to do that.
We have to educate people though, because young people coming out today with their families don't know the dangers of what going back would look like and what it was, because they don't know they have waiver services because people fought to get services in the community. So we have to really educate those families and people about what could happen if we don't all work together to keep moving forward.
Well, and I hopefully this podcast will serve as a piece of that educational puzzle. I know, Tracy, you've devoted your life to education and training. And so thank you to you, Tracy, and to Steve and to Kathy, not only for your contributions today, but for a lifetime of service to making the world a better place for people with disabilities. So,
well, thank you for the partnership, because it's not one person, it's us all working together.
absolutely.
Strategizing for new ideas, how to make it better.
Yep.